Good afternoon, good morning, good evening for those depending on different time lags. It's a pleasure to host you today in this Innovation for Strong Sustainability webinar. The Limits to Growth report is 50 years old. The Brundtland report is and Sustainable Development is 35 years old. And yet we have collectively failed at generating development that is sustainable for economic, social, and ecological aspects. Why is it the case? How did we fail? These are the questions that we are going to try to answer today. My name is Antoine GODIN. I'm the head of the macroeconomic modeling team at the AFD, where we contribute to developing strong sustainability trajectories with country partners. Why did we not succeed? It might be the case that we have been using concepts that are fundamentally neutralizer of conflict, that we have been avoiding to address the difficulties of attaining social, ecological, and economic sustainability at once. And this is why at AFD, we have been working on a new concept, a concept that existed in the literature for over 50 years, but bringing it to light and trying to understand how strong sustainability can help us in designing trajectories that are actually delivering on the promises of sustainable development. The idea of strong sustainability fundamentally assumes that there is no substitution possible between economic, ecological, and social factors, that you have to respect all types of capital, natural, social, and economic, and that you cannot substitute one for the other. Once you accept that principle, that there is no substitution, this fundamentally highlights the fact that you have to have multidimensional analysis. Multidimensional in the sense that you have multidisciplinary, you will have to combine aspects of ecological, aspects of climate, aspects of sociology, aspects of economics, but also multidimensional in the sense that you have to address different scales, geographical, like at the local and national scale, but different timing scale, short-term and long-term. And these multidimensional analysis will highlight the tensions and the synergies there are between attaining different types of sustainability. And the third concept that we have put forward is the fact that on top of this multidimensional analysis, you have to have a governance structure, a social construct towards what is desirable, towards the sustainable state that we are striving for. And that this governance structure, this social construct, is both towards where we want to go and the trajectories that allow us to go there. This concept has been at the core of our international research conference a year and a half ago in December in Paris, where we had started to explore different aspects of sustainability and structural sustainability. And less than a month ago, we had a special issue published in the International Journal of Political Economy around strong sustainable development trajectories, where we were trying to understand the different dynamics that were connected to the ideas of development trajectories and assessing whether you could have macroeconomic and ecological sustainability at the same time. When we design these strong sustainability trajectories, one key element is to understand how the productive structure is connected to the ecological footprint on the one hand, the macroeconomic and financial stability on the other hand, and many of the social structures and institutions. Think about employment structure, income distribution, social construct, and trade unions and whatnot. So all of these are interconnected fundamentally through the production structure of economies. And if we are serious about designing and implementing just ecological transition, we need to think about how structural change how to ensure structural change that is transformative, that will change the way in which we produce, but the way in which we distribute income, the way in which we consider employment, the way in which we consider social dynamics, alongside with structural production dynamics, and ecological footprint. And in this context, it is very important to understand how innovation and technological change will also need to change in demand and demand structure, but also in new social dynamics and institutional evolutions. This is why we launched 2 years ago the research project with the Stockholm Environment Institute on innovation and strong sustainability. And the presentation that you will hear today is the outcome of this 2-year project. The project aimed to understand innovation dynamics from a global south perspective and understanding its interconnection with macro dynamics, social dynamics, and ecological footprint. Furthermore, there's a significant effort in this project to try to have a mapping of what is existing currently. How can we characterize the economies where they are right now in their strong sustainability, and how far away can they be from a good desired state? And there has been a lot of work on constructing the data set, on analyzing the data set, and having methodologies that would be applicable for these thinking about innovation. We are very honored to have potentially 3 different distinguished speakers. Currently, only with us, we have Emily GHOSH. Emily is, Emily is a staff scientist in the Equitable Transition program at the Stockholm Environment Institute in the US. And here she focuses on assessing the equity and environmental justice dimension of the sustainable transition, and on development climate change mitigation plans and policies that are equitable and just. Most of her research involves quantitative analysis through the development of long-term energy and economic models. She also studies alternative economic paradigms such as degrowth and green growth, the energy-water-food nexus, and gender issues in energy planning. Along with us as well, there is Eric KEMP-BENEDICT, who is an associate professor of ecological economics at the University of Leeds, where he leads the Ecological Economics Master's program, and affiliated researcher with the Stockholm Environment Institute in the US. His research focuses on the macroeconomic of a sustainability transition, working within post-Keynesian structuralist and classical traditions, but viewing the economy through an ecological economic lens. And he addresses questions around long-run growth, decoupling, structural change, and economic development. And potentially, we will have Oscar Lecuyer, who's an environmental and climate change economist, directing the research program on low-carbon transition and environmental sustainability at the AFD. His work aims to understand better the policies that countries can adopt to meet development goals while fighting climate change. To this end, he is involved in public policy dialogue between AFD operatives and partner countries such as Colombia and Mexico. He also contributes to the national international discussion on development trajectories compatible with the Paris Agreement in connection with the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative by IDRI. And in addition, he is coordinating a project for an environmental sustainability indicator in partnership with the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. I can see that Oscar hasn't joined us yet. Maybe he will, depending on whether we have connections issues or not. Anyway, I will leave the floor to our speakers. So Emily will present the data set aiming to assess strong sustainability aspects of countries from an ecological and social perspective. Eric will then propose an extension of the ES gap, and we'll present this in a moment, and called the social environment sustainability gap, data envelopment approach, and the insight it can give us on innovation dynamics. And then finally, we'll have a discussion of the 2 presentations, either with Oscar or with myself, and we will have time for Q&A following. For all of you that are following us online, please do not hesitate to use the chat. I will monitor all of these questions and make sure to convey them to our presenters. I think we can just start and have the slides showing up, and I will do a short introduction on the environmental sustainability gap indicator that UCL, the University College London, has developed and financed by AFD and been applied in different developing economies. So can we have the slides? Thank you. Okay, so I'm just subbing for Oscar on the spot. Why should we worry about the state of our environment? Well, this is the idea of strong environmental sustainability. First, we have the assessment that the state of the planet is alarming. Currently, we have a biodiversity collapse, we have climate change, global warming, we have different dynamics that clearly are showing that environmentally we are leading towards overpassing the planetary boundaries. But on the other hand, and that's worrisome for itself, but furthermore, the nature can contribute critically to human well-being and survival. And the idea of strong sustainability is to connect this explicit representation of what we can call critical natural capital or environmental dynamics, and connect these with the society and economy in a way where the environment is critical for the existence of society and economy, not as a substitute between the three. And this is why you can see on the slides where you have a weak sustainability approach where they are interconnected, and a strong sustainability approach where they are embedded within each other. And so this is the fundamental idea behind the strong sustainability that I was describing just before. To do this, we are going to need data to actually try to assess the situation in which we are. And for that, there are different levels of indicators, headline indicators, high-level commitments such as GDP, HDI, CO2 reduction, strong environmental sustainability indicator. So that's the headline. And then for all of these, you actually decrease and decline them into more appropriate and detailed indicators. And the goal of the discussion today, we will see, is about constructing these indicators, ensuring that they are relevant for the dynamic we are trying to assess, and seeing how they are interconnected in delivering social indicators. There are 3 case studies that we could mention. I'll briefly go over them. The first one is the heat-based nature contribution to people. So there's a lot of information here gathered on how nature's contribution are being there, and whether the dynamics, whether the evolution of the contribution are declining or increasing. In the IPBES report, we can see that they are all declining, but the quality of the indicator are poor. And it begs the question of which indicator are the most adequate, is the most adequate to describe critical natural capital dynamics. When are we in safe territory? Is there tipping points? What is sustainability? To do this, there has been other approaches, such as the planetary boundaries, where a scientific assessment has been defining which boundary should not be overpassed, and knowing that if we were to overpass them, then we would enter in a critical zone where society and the environmental dynamics would be unsustainable. And so the recent assessment of the planetary boundaries shows that 6 of the 9 boundaries are being transgressed. It gives us an idea of how far we are from resilient dynamics. But the problem is that it doesn't say so much about what happens afterwards, and it doesn't say how far we are from the boundary. We know that we have passed them, but it doesn't give us an idea of the distance, the gap that we need to restore to stay within the boundaries. And this is why the ESGAP AFD has decided to fund the ESGAP framework, where it gives us an idea on the limits, the good environmental state, and how far we are. Are we away? Have we overpassed it? So are we in a sustainable space, or are we away from it? Did we reduce so much? Did we destroy so much the environment that we are not in a sustainable space? Are we too far away from the sustainable space? And so as ESGAP allows to detail the current state of affairs of the environment by distinguishing different sources and different indicators, that allows us to have a good understanding of where we are, on which source and on which indicator, and helps informing policies and strategies to say, okay, we are going to try to restore these dynamics because these are the furthest away, for example. So this is the idea behind the ESGAP framework, which has been applied for many different developing economies, and which was one of the starting point of this entire discussion that we are going to have with Eric and Emily on a social and environmental sustainability gap indicator. And so with this, I will leave the floor to Emily to explain to us how she built with colleagues this strong sustainability indicator data set. And thank you, Emily, again for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoine, for the introduction, and to AFD for having me here today to discuss our project on identifying strong sustainability indicators. Today, I'm really going to focus on the methodology we developed for identifying indicators to represent strong sustainability, and we'll also share an initial set of categories and indicators that we have found. And so when the process of finding and selecting indicators is just as important as the indicators themselves. Currently, there's no standardized process that has been used for selecting indicators. There are many indicator data sets out there. So we looked into the various methods and assessed the advantages and the disadvantages of the various methodologies to come up with this one. Sorry. So one study found that indicator selection methods are often very unsystematic and lack transparency. So we try to be as systematic as possible and provide full reasoning and documentation where needed. So the process of selecting indicators really involves striking a balance between ensuring that it's comprehensive, but also keeping the number of indicators to something that is manageable. So we start out with a very large set of indicators and try to narrow it down slowly throughout the various steps that we take. So the first step that we try to take is to really define the purpose. What is the purpose and need for these indicators? What are the indicators meant to represent? At what geographic scale? Who is the main audience for these indicators? And so after understanding the purpose, we try to find a suitable conceptual framework which we then use to find indicators. And then the second step of the process was to conduct a literature review So many of these indicator development processes really start by doing a stakeholder consultation, but this can be quite time consuming, particularly when there are no initial set of indicators to provide input on. So for this reason, steps 2 to 4 of our process really involves conducting a literature review and narrowing down the indicators before presenting it for stakeholder and expert input. And so in step 2, we start the literature review to find an initial set of indicators. Step 3, we then come up with indicator selection criteria. And so we did a literature review of that to find what would be good criteria to assess the suitability of individual indicators and the whole set of indicators that we found. And then step 4 is to evaluate the criteria, evaluate the indicators against this criteria. And so in this step, it's really divided into two screening processes. One is to do a more qualitative screening, each individual, is it relevant? Is it reliable? Do we have enough data? And then we screen, we do a qualitative screening of the whole set of indicators. Is there duplication? Are they well balanced? And then we haven't done this yet, but this is one of the next steps in our that is in progress, which is to do a more quantitative screening. So to do a statistical analysis called a principal component analysis to find correlations between different indicators. This can really highlight what are the driving indicators, the main drivers, and it's commonly used in this type of indicator analysis to reduce the indicator set to those that really captures the key dimensions of the indicators that we're looking at. So following step 4 and this screening process, it's really important to then to have other input into this process to reduce bias, to increase perspectives. And so this will involve consulting experts as well as stakeholders, users, and to really broaden the perspectives that are involved in this project. So this can involve workshops, focus groups, surveys, but there's also been numerous studies on sustainability indicators, so we can draw on the stakeholder analysis and the user input for those projects too, to really find where the priorities, to help identify priorities, potentially new indicators. We can get input into the processes taken to this point, into the selection criteria, and input into the analysis itself. And then hopefully this could be a slightly iterative process until we come up with the final set of indicators. So now I'm going to go through each of the steps in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned, our first step in the process was to define the purpose and the need for the indicators. In this project, these indicators are meant to monitor progress towards achieving strong sustainability at a national scale. The main audience are policymakers so that they're able to develop policies as needed to move closer to the goal, or there could be other organizations and researchers that also are interested, but ultimately we want to move towards strong sustainability. Now, strong sustainability is represented by both biophysical and social indicators, as Antoine had mentioned. So the biophysical indicators are used to monitor the demand for and use of critical natural capital. The social dimensions are not explicit to strong sustainability, but it's implied by the requirement to safeguard this natural capital to meet the needs of both the present and future generations. So how are the needs defined? That's what human welfare is. We need to consider human welfare in relation to its use of natural capital. And human welfare includes both material and non-material needs that vary across cultures, climates, scales, and time periods. And so given what strong sustainability means, who the audience is, and these various parameters, we found that a modified pressure state response PSR framework, as shown in the figure to the right, is well suited for a study as it covers the various dimensions of strong sustainability, both the social and the biophysical. We modified the traditional PSR, we call it the modified social PSR, which combines the traditional PSR for environmental indicators developed by the OECD in 2003, and those are the green circles, and we combine that with the complementary social indicator framework by the OECD developed in 2007. So we kind of merged the two together. What's really different about this framework is that what's key here are the linkages. The links between the different categories is really important because that makes us understand what's the pressure, what are the links, what are the responses, how do we link these different things, how are these things linked together, and how do we respond to each situation. And so, though not shown, the economic system, while an important feature of our society, we consider it as a means for provisioning natural resources to meet these social incomes. So it's one of the activities that links the social and environmental dimensions together. Now I'm going to look into each component in a bit more detail. And so this here is the traditional pressure state response framework. The environmental pressure are human activities. The environmental pressure component refers to the pressures that are incompatible with the preservation of critical natural capital. So these pressures can be direct pressures, such as the use of natural capital, like land, materials, energy, to satisfy needs like household development, agricultural systems, transport infrastructure, and so on. And then other pressures are the resulting waste and emissions from these activities upon the environment. The environmental state is the natural capital, biophysical resources, ecosystem functions. And so this focuses on the condition of critical natural capital and their current state. Then we have the societal response. And so information on how far we are from tipping points and ecological thresholds is then conveyed to to society, for the government, communities, private sector, whoever, to then come up with a response to prioritize the preservation and restoration of critical natural capital. And so that's one really important piece, is how the society responds to the pressure and the state. And then we have the social components. So the social context is really the description of the nation state. What is the income level? How big is the population? What is the type of government? That's really what the social context is. And that also impacts the societal response and the social status, which is human well-being. The social status is really important because it's part of the step for environmental pressures, involves identifying human needs and need satisfiers for social sustainability, or what is the social status. So we have to ensure that these human activities reduce stress on the environment. There are many definitions of what is of human welfare, what is satisfactory. As I mentioned, this could include material needs like health, food, shelter, energy, water, as well as non-material needs like happiness or community, sovereignty, reduced inequality. So we consider human welfare from a variety of perspectives, including those that are of particular importance to low and lower middle income countries. And so then how does this fit into that bigger framework that I had discussed earlier? After coming up with this conceptual framework, the PSR framework, we used the literature. We conducted a literature review in 3 steps. So the first step of this literature review was to identify the categories. So in the previous stage, we have different pressures and states, but really, what are those key environmental and social categories that we're looking at? And so we used the donut economics framework as a starting point for identifying categories. Given that it has this interaction between ecological thresholds, which are the planetary boundaries, and on the outer ring, and then meeting social and human needs within the inner ring. So this was what we used as a starting point for identifying categories. But then as we did this PSR analysis, there's more categories that came up that are specifically very important to strong sustainability under the environmental indicators. Soil degradation and the loss of non-renewable resources or natural capital is very key to strong sustainability. So this is what we added in addition to what the donut economics framework previously had. And similarly, in the social indicator analysis, we found a number of new categories that we added. For example, land right, tenure rights, life satisfaction, cultural heritage, and technology and innovation. And then following this enumeration of the various categories, that's when we, for each category, did this analysis of the in this example here is for climate change. We started with what is the target that we're aiming for? What is that goal? As Antoine mentioned, often without knowing what we're trying to aim for, it's hard to move towards that. So we identified a target either based on what was specified in the donut economics framework, or if it was a new category, what the other literature out there had for that target. And then we also identified, using the PSR analysis, what is the environmental pressure, what is the ideal information we would like for the environmental state, what are some of the societal responses for addressing climate change, for example, and what is the resulting social status. So first we tried to come up with what are some of the ideal indicators that we would like under each category, and then went out and tried to find it. And this was what the challenging part, we went through a lot of databases and different data sets, probably had like 1,000, narrowed that down to about 206 indicators, tried to find at least one for each PSR category. And so that's where we ended up following the literature review. Next step was to do the find selection criteria. So how are we going to narrow it down from 206 to even further? So these were some of the criteria that we came up with. The blue is what the criteria for measuring each indicator. So, is the indicator relevant to strong sustainability? Does it either track natural capital, track human welfare, or track the interaction between the two? Is it measurable either quantitatively or semi-quantitatively? Is the data that is available easily accessible and obtained with limited human and financial resources, especially for places, countries, and where finding the data easily would be beneficial just because of the resources that are available. Does it have good data coverage, multiple years of coverage so that we can see trends and changes? And does it have coverage in both the global north and south? Is the data coming from a scientifically robust and reproducible method? Is it well documented? And then the last last criteria that we used to assess each indicator was, whether it was understandable, whether there was no uncertainty about which direction is good or bad. And then once we narrowed down the individual indicators, we looked at the whole set, and we looked at whether there was overlap or duplication in any way, if there was any double counting, and if it covered all aspects of strong sustainability. And so following this qualitative analysis, we narrowed it down to 76 indicators. It's still a lot, but and we fully recognize that. But I think it's it's really comprehensive. It covers all the different aspects. But like I mentioned, we still have a little bit of more work to do that statistical analysis, see where which indicators might come out as more statistically significant, and then also to then work with different experts to really and stakeholders to really prioritize which ones are of importance. And so the way that we have while it's not shown here in our documentation, we have it laid out by category, so you can see the pressure state status and societal response for each category, and be able to kind of follow that thread when making decisions. You'll be able to kind of understand what the various concerns are, or where the concerns may lie. So yeah, so that's what we've done so far, and the process that we use. But there's still some gaps and limitations that we hope to work through. Using the framework that we had, we started with a donut economics framework, and just generally it's very anthropocentric. There's limited biodiversity indicators to begin with, and so that's one challenge, especially when strong sustainability is to look at natural capital. There's a lot of ecosystem services and things like that that are just not even known. We don't know what to measure, and so these things are not necessarily measured. Then there's things like domestication of animals, animal welfare. That is something that is really important, but there wasn't much information on that. It's mostly human welfare that we had focused on. The extent that the current set of indicators captures illegal activities like wildlife trafficking, illegal fishing, logging, that sort of things. These activities often affect ecosystems, biodiversity, and sustainable development. So without including these activities, it makes it difficult to really understand the extent and negative impact of these and how to manage it. Then, given that we were looking at it at a national scale, looking at the dynamics between countries and how those exacerbate certain issues, that's not well captured in this in the indicators that are currently that have been found, and those can have a huge impact. The trade patterns, consumption patterns, power dynamics between countries can really affect how resources are shared and distributed. And similarly, power dynamics within a country, the data sets really look at the average population, but there could be really large differences if there's depending on the level of inequality that exists within a country. So looking at those differences within a country, I mean, that would really expand the data set even more, but that's just one kind of limitation when we look at it just at a national scale. Then there's some limitations just because of the data itself. Some data is just not collected. It could be politically sensitive. Making sure that we have a data set where we have data for the same number of years and things like that. All the data covers different years and different time periods, different geographies, and so that's also one limitation. Some environmental indicators we just couldn't find because they're focused on global phenomena like ocean acidification. That information is not available at a national scale. There's biases that exist in the data that is developed. There's differences in methodologies between countries. There's even biases probably in the selection of these indicators. So that's why having stakeholder input is very important. And then while we try to be comprehensive in terms of what is important environmentally and socially, this really depends on, there's differences between cultures and what they place importance on. And so that's something to take into account. All right, so that's all I have for you today, and looking forward to answering your questions. And now I'll leave it to Eric to explain what his work is.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, thank you very much. Just to mention to all of the participants that the chat and the questions are well alive, and so feel free to continue to contribute to the discussion. It's extremely interesting. We'll take the questions in the end, if that's okay with you, Emily, and let Eric respond first, and then we'll organize the discussion afterwards. But please do continue to ask your questions. And Eric, I'm now turning to you. Please go ahead, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to discuss two separate things and then pull them together with other aspects of this presentation towards the end. since this is a presentation of work under a particular project that we did with AFD, I just wanted to mention one part of that project is not being presented here. It was on macroeconomic modeling, and that's kind of a separate issue. Here, we really want to focus on what you can do with the indicators. And the first, I'm going to mention a proposed methodology. So as you could see, the data sets that we're interested in, the one that was the presentation prepared by Oscar Lecuyer and presented by Antoine GODIN, and then from Emily, those are in development. This methodology that I will present is intended to apply to those data sets, but at the moment, I'm applying it to some that already exist out in the world. So here's the basic idea. When you look not just at environmental indicators, but as Emily was pulling together, environmental and social indicators, and you plot them somehow, you tend to see this sort of thing, that there's no country reaches the goal, the sustainability goal, which is this golden circle. And in fact, there seems to be a bit of a trade-off between environmental impact and social benefit. You can see this across different data sets. The two here will come back later. The first is the Global Footprint Network on the left, and on the right is A Good Life for All. And there's a method called data envelopment analysis, or DEA. And DEA is, in some ways, it looks complex, but the basic idea is pretty simple. It says, okay, you look across all countries, and you can say, there's more or less a frontier of what countries have been able to do in moving towards some desired state. And the desired state is more social benefit with less environmental impact. It's basically the idea. And that sort of setup where you say you want more of some things and less of others, that's basically the DEA approach. It's non-parametric, which is handy. You don't have to specify a particular function. The analysis is of some generic decision-making units. And then the measure of efficiency is the gap between where you are and the frontier. And the proposal here is to build on that idea of the environmental gap, the ES gap, environmental sustainability gap. First, extend it to include social indicators as well as environmental indicators, but also to split the gap in two. One of them is the gap between where you are as a country and the frontier. The frontier shows the best that any country has been able to do. The rest of it is a systemic gap. And here's the idea. The one that's between the country and the frontier is idiosyncratic, what the country can do to move to the frontier. And it is given directly from a DEA calculation, just using standard methods. The systemic gap is the gap between the frontier and the sustainable state. And that, I would argue, is beyond any single country's capacity to address. That is a global challenge. And the total sustainability gap is defined as the sum of those two. So, environmental gap, ES gap. The total is the state where you are minus the target. You've gone past the target. You're adding too much pressure. Idiosyncratic is the slack, and then systemic, you calculate that way. The social gap is instead, how far behind are you? You want to go higher to get to a social threshold. So it's the target minus your current state. Idiosyncratic is still the slack. You get that straight from the DEA analysis, and then you have the systemic one. Now, there's a refinement that we applied. Different countries, which are in this case the decision-making units, have different characteristics. They're at different income levels. Some are landlocked, some are small, and in particular, maybe small island developing states. Those are also, isolated by water or disconnected by water or connected by water, depending on how you look at it. And for equity reasons, I would argue that you should compare like with like, and there's a standard way to do that with data envelopment analysis, DEA. And so for this analysis, low-income countries are compared to other low-income countries. Lower middle-income countries are compared to lower middle-income countries, but also to low-income countries, and so on. Upper middle-income countries are compared to others at their same income level and below. High-income countries are compared to all other countries. And I did that with the Global Footprint Network data, where you've got, they provide a data set where they have their global footprint measured by the number of Earths the country takes up per, if their population were extrapolated to the whole world population, and then the Human Development Index. And you can see that these thresholds differ for low-income countries, lower middle, upper middle, and high-income countries, but overall you get this kind of frontier. Now, it's very hard to see what's going on. So I'm going to zoom in. And once you zoom in, you can say, okay, actually, we have to be careful here. This frontier is helpful. It's useful. I mean, here you've got, for example, Argentina. Seems like a good one to compare to. Switzerland. I believe that's Mexico. No, that would be lower income. Sorry. Nope, not sure which one. My mistake. But you have to be careful. Haiti and the Palestinian territories have low footprints, environmental footprints, but that is not, in their cases, a sign of sustainability. The Bahamas is here. It's a service-oriented small island state. It might not be scalable, might not apply. So you have to think it through. And then some countries on the frontier might be flagged as outliers with an appropriate methodology. And so the point that I want to make is that this would be part of a fuller analysis. The SESGAP DEA method will give insights, but not answers. You can't say, this is it, this is all I need, and go away. You have to add other analysis. In future, we plan to apply this to the strong sustainability indicators and the SGAP indicators that were presented earlier, include economic indicators, use methods to identify outliers, refine the set of countries that are used for evaluation, and also look dynamically. It changes over time. Now, that was one environmental indicator, one social indicator. But in reality, as you saw, there are a lot of SGAP indicators. There are a lot. Emily noted too many right now. We're going to simplify for the strong sustainability indicators. In order to do that kind of analysis, we wanted to apply the method to an existing data set that has multiple environmental and social indicators. And we chose the Good Life for All data set. It's a publicly available data set. These happen to be the indicators and thresholds that they chose. But I won't go further on defining that. I simply took it and used it to show how this methodology, this SESGAP DEA methodology works. Now, when there are many indicators, you have to use weights, and it's explicit in the DEA methodology. Once you add weights to indicators, you're ultimately making a value judgment. I would argue that's okay for a strong sustainability analysis because it is consistent with the principle that Antoine mentioned before of the need for a social construction of a good condition. And I would argue that after you have applied this, for individual countries, look at the systemic and idiosyncratic gaps separately for each indicator. It's one country. Look at them all. For the world, look at the systemic gaps of countries on the frontier and sum them up using the weights that you've already assigned. As a technical matter, after setting negative systemic gaps to 0. So I'll just set that aside. That's a technical point. And here's an example for a single country, Kenya. This is for the Good Life for All data set, applying SESGAP DEA with a default set of weights that is just based on the data set itself. And you can see, actually, if you look at the SGAP, it's negative, which means everything is satisfied. It's fine. But if you look at the idiosyncratic gap, some are positive. I'll say what that means in a moment. On the social indicators, there are positive gaps. That means Kenya has not achieved those social targets. But the idiosyncratic gaps are smaller. So what we see here is, for example, on phosphorus, it's within the boundary compared to the absolute target. But there is room to improve compared to other lower middle income countries. Another thing you might notice is the ranking of the top 3 gaps differs when you're looking at the total and just the idiosyncratic part. And remember, that's the one that the country has some measure of control over. The systemic gaps are global challenges. And so, as I said, you know, for SGAP, all these are negative. The total gap is negative. So it's within the thresholds. But when you look at idiosyncratic gaps, in fact, there's room to maneuver on land system change compared to other lower middle income countries, phosphorus application, and to a much smaller degree, material footprint. That's practically 0. For the total social gaps, the highest one is income poverty, clearly. Next, sanitation, and then there is a tie for life satisfaction and access to energy. But when you look at the idiosyncratic gaps, comparing to other countries at a similar income level, access to energy is top. Sanitation is next, and nutrition is next. Those are areas where, compared to other lower middle income countries, there looks like there could be room to improve. Now, this is the approach that I suggested for looking at the frontier. So this is the global challenges. Every country listed here, Botswana, Central African Republic, Australia, Costa Rica, etc., all of these are actually on the frontier. They have 0 idiosyncratic gaps. They are plotted against their summed and weighted systemic gaps. And what you see here is that, yes, all of them are on the frontier, but that does not mean that they are all good examples. Central African Republic has very high social gaps, low environmental gap, but high social gaps. Australia, very low social gaps, but very high environmental gaps. Costa Rica, doing rather well. And the key message that I want to make is that individual countries cannot be expected to close systemic gaps alone. They can work on their idiosyncratic gaps. The systemic gaps are global challenges. And I'm going to just pause and say I will go on to the next presentation, and then I'll bring them together and wrap them up. The next one is on innovation in developing countries. So, innovation and economic development. First, just in general, economic development is characterized by structural change, which is driven by productivity growth and also changes in production structure. This was a point that was emphasized by Antoine. Changes and changing production structure, that adjusts to meet changes in domestic demand, external changes in export demand, but also strategic targeting of export markets. And in some cases, those can be associated with what are called windows of opportunity for new market expansion. Innovation in developing countries has unique features that are different from high-income countries. Informal activity is important, both for learning and competition. And this is a hypothesis by Egbetokun and his co-authors based on years of research on their own. This was a paper where they summarized a lot of their insights. They argued that before gaining capabilities, you first have to gain some competencies. And so there's this extra step. So it can look like a delay before you gain capabilities to work with particular technologies. In fact, something is happening, you just don't see it because competencies are being built. And then later, you see the capabilities being exhibited. The other is that windows of opportunity can arise in surprising sectors. And there are a few different papers there where individual developing countries have identified windows of opportunity that were not necessarily the ones that you might have imagined. The Oslo Manual is the international standard for doing research on innovation. This is innovation in firms, so not social innovation, not policy innovation, but technological innovation in firms. And they split it into product, process, and management, and also whether it is new to the firm, new to the market, and new to the world. And those are associated with certain activities in general. So product innovation, the main goal is to expand the market. And it does affect productivity, but mostly through composition effects. Process innovation is mostly to raise productivity. And then management typically increases your capacity to undertake innovative activities. And what you see, what is observed, is that the bulk of innovation in developing countries is on non-technological management innovation that is new to the firm or to the market. And next in line, process innovation that is new to the firm and new to the market, and to a smaller degree, product innovation new to the firm, new to the market. Much less on new to the world. Whereas in high-income countries, the focus of research and the focus of attention is on new to market and new to the world product and process innovation. And so a lot of the literature misses these processes going on in developing countries. Another area of work in the innovation literature for developing countries is focused on innovation pathways. And very broadly, it goes from imitative to creative. And I'm going to mention 3 pathways that have been identified. And there is, as far as I know, no systematic classification of these kinds of pathways. So these are ones that have been identified as general patterns in the literature, but there could be others. One is if you have a weak intellectual property regime, so patent protection is weak, for example, then you can go through a pattern of direct imitation and reverse engineering, learn from that. So you just take it apart, you learn from doing, using, and interacting. That then provides a basis for science, technology, and innovation, STI. And then at some point, get to the point where you want to protect your own IPR. And, you can imagine, I'm sure we can all think of one or more countries that has taken that path. Where intellectual property rights are strong, there's a narrower pathway to go through. You have to engage with global value chains. One characteristic way to do it is with original equipment manufacture, where you simply get the instructions from abroad. Once again, doing, using, interacting, get to the point where you can use original design manufacture, and then through a combination of doing, using, interacting, and science, technology, and innovation, move to original brand manufacture, and then that's really fully launched. Another one that is a bit different but worth mentioning is a difference along a pathway that is distinguished by the patent cycle. So one is where you start with long patent cycle and low value added. Agriculture is a standard kind of activity here, but so is some manufacturing, lower smaller scale manufacturing. And then through a combination of STI and DUI modes of learning, you can go to short cycle, high value added. So based on capabilities that have been built once competencies were built. Classic example there is software, where it is intrinsically short patent cycles. You rapidly come out with new software, and that can supplant a previous one. But high value added. And then over the longer term, go for long cycle, high value added vehicles are over here, for example. One point to note is that local firms have to have competencies already built if they're going to actually learn from global value chain participation. This is one reason why the literature on gains from GVC participation is so all over the place, is because some firms do have those competencies and they are actively seeking to learn. Others are more passive, and the lesson is the firms that have competencies that allow them to learn from it and are actively seeking to learn perform better in general. But again, we see this gap in the research. The focus in high-income countries is on the creative end, where there's strong IPR regimes. Most firms are engaged in original brand manufacture, and there's a predominance of long cycle, high value added activities. So again, the bulk of the research does not apply to a lot of what is happening in developing countries. There is a lot of need for further research, and there are groups active in this research throughout the world. But I just want to flag that. They may not be publishing in the conventional publications that you're used to seeing, but that's where a lot of the work is happening on innovation in developing countries. Now, if you take this literature on innovation and that idea of different innovation pathways, now here I'm going to go out, stick my neck out, and this is a bit risky. What I'm going to discuss right here is based on a desk study, literature-based. I was not engaged on the ground in Colombia. However, already in prior work from AFD on sunset and sunrise sectors under climate change, the fossil carbon extraction that is a primary focus in Colombia is identified as a sunset sector. In a decarbonizing world, it would not have a future. There's also an important garment industry. Garment industry is another classic long cycle, lower value added, and it's also just intrinsically facing some difficulties, has been in Colombia recently. It's a simple fact the economy is geographically fragmented because of just the topography of the country, and there's a high degree of informality. These are challenges, not the only challenges, but those are challenges. But I really want to highlight strengths. Colombia has global innovation networks. They have a chemicals industry that is currently based on the fossil carbon extraction industry, but it's a chemicals industry. Talk to a chemical engineer, they don't have to use fossil fuels. They have a strong high-tech agricultural innovation system that was built up over decades. There's a very nice paper on that, highlighting the change in the focus of research and the international networks that they got plugged into. So here's where I'm just going to step out. So all of that was the literature. Now I'm going to step out and say, there is a possible sunrise sector for Colombia through a window of opportunity. And the starting point is just a statement. Globally, the chemicals industry is based on what are called platform chemicals, small chemicals that are used to make other chemicals. They're high value added, and they're at the base of multiple value chains, which means they have what are called high forward linkages, meaning that you can build downstream activities. The patent cycle for fossil-based platform chemicals is long, making ethylene. The pathways are well established, but potentially short for bio-based chemicals. That's because it's a new sector, it's immature, and there's no fixed process for making either existing platform chemicals or ones that are better suited to bio-based chemicals. And the chemical industry plus agricultural innovation systems, take those together, those exist in the country, they could provide the starting conditions for a bio-based chemicals innovation system. So this is just an example of how I'm saying, look at what is there, focus on the strengths, and ask, is there a way to move along one of those innovation changes? Okay, this is my final slide. The key message, I'm going to repeat again, from the SESGAP DEA methodology is that individual countries cannot be expected to close systemic gaps alone. To address systemic gaps, promising ideas have to be shared. This is a global challenge. Don't lock up IP and engage in co-development. So you share IP. Innovations have to be adapted to local conditions, and it has to be allowed to happen. There is no one-size-fits-all technology. And uniformly apply incentives and disincentives that have to do with these systemic gaps, without barriers or pollution havens being created. Those are systemic gaps. For the idiosyncratic gaps, there's more you can do within an individual country. But first, understand why the gaps exist. That's going to be country-specific. And understand the local innovation systems. High-income country lessons are unlikely to translate into a developing country context. And bear in mind that capabilities and capacities take a long time to build. So look for existing strengths where those are already in place and build from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric, Emily. I think this has been tremendously interesting so far, and the discussion was quite active in the chat. So I'll try to synthesize most of the comments, questions that I could see into three broad categories of question. The first one is related to the idea of what I would define, but maybe we can redefine this better. It's a kind of a participatory approach to science and policy making. So how do you prioritize? How do you create arbitrage? with whom do you talk? So there was at least two questions. The first one is, did you already identify to whom you should or want to talk in testing the database and the indicator you have selected, and trying to synthesize them, because as you were saying, 70 plus is probably a bit complicated to discuss. And a following question, which I was asking, which was that, okay, but then what is the role of indicators and tools in supporting policy making? Because I mean, there's a bit of a question there on should we provide the answer or not, and what are the role there in this? The second broad type of question is the emerging priorities or the emerging hierarchy of science, if you want, that seems to appear, and we can discuss whether it's a correct assessment or not. But there was one question which was, why is it the case that international institutions focus on economy, even though we all agree that sustainable development is about economy, social, and ecological aspects? And why is it the case that there is this kind of appearing dominance of economics? And the second question, which was not exactly the same, but was not exactly asked like that, but what happens when a leading indicator or an indicator on which you focus appears to be misleading, or that you thought, and there was a question about, okay, what if we discovered that CO2 emissions is not really primarily based by energy usage, but mostly by deforestation? What happens then? Does it delegitimate the indicator? Does it change the priorities? How do you deal with this? And the third question is really related to complexity and multidimensionality. So there was two types of questions. The first one is, can the model account for interactions between indicators, and how is it incorporated? And then the second question, which is connected, is how do you are there different weights in the combination of indicators between social and environmental? If so, yeah. If yes, how explicit? Why? And if not, and I guess it's more of a question for the DAA that Eric presented, how do you account for the different weights or priorities, if you want, that you want to give to the different indicators? I think I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to hear your response. I propose to start with Emily, and then we can move on to Eric. And then in the meantime, I'll see if I have missed any other questions.
Thanks, Antoine. Yeah, so in terms of the the process itself and who to include, we haven't formally thought through what that stakeholder engagement process would look like, but I think it is important to, I think a diversity of perspectives is important. That's kind of the mindset that one would take. That means from both developing and developed countries, policymakers, those that are marginalized groups. I think it's important to talk to different people as they have different priorities, but then this might make things more confusing and more complicated, especially, and that's part of the challenge, is that when the impacts of climate change and the cause of, like, the determinants of climate change is driven by very large differences between countries and within countries, how can an indicator data set kind of represent that? It could mean that, should we have different indicators for different countries, different priorities, different weightings? That's something that might be a way to overcome this, because as Eric said, you can't compare countries of different income levels to each other, and there's other differences that exist. So I think that's important to recognize, that maybe coming up with an indicator database where everything is weighted equally for each country and context may not be reasonable, but to identify some of those key those key indicators, that might be common, because when we talk about human welfare, there are many commonalities that exist in terms of our needs and what is ultimately meeting those needs. That's where the differences occur, how our needs are met, whether we're using fossil energy or renewable energy, that's where the differences lie. But those needs itself, there's some fundamental commonalities, and so understanding where those commonalities lie and where those differences exist, both between and within countries, I think is important. And I think while we can do this qualitative and quantitative, analysis using literature review, I think having that input is also important. But so that's kind of my take on that. And that covers some of the questions. And I think it is very important to recognize that interaction between the social and environmental dimensions, like that is essentially what we try to do, is show that for each of the challenges that are occurring, there's both an environmental and social component to it. And so recognizing that we kind of need to tackle the different aspects when coming up with policies and things like that. There's no one size fits all solution. So you kind of have to think through, like, look at those different aspects when tackling in certain challenges. So, yep. I guess in terms of whether a leading indicator is misleading, like, for example, carbon emissions, that's again a big challenge if you're only selecting one indicator. How do you unpack all of that? And also, do you have the data to unpack all of that? Because that's where, while doing this, the trying to find indicators, it started with, well, what is ideal? But then really finding those ideal indicators is incredibly challenging. A lot of that data isn't out there, or it doesn't have good coverage across time or spatially. And so that's another big challenge. And so sometimes, and I don't know if this is the right way to say, but sometimes we try to use data to explain the things that people already know. And so I think, and as a data person, I recognize that there are strong limitations in just relying on quantitative data alone, and because that doesn't, because there are reasons why some things aren't, the data isn't collected, and the data may not be collected in a way that is just truly aggregated. Like, to look at inequalities, a lot of, like, energy consumption, for example, that's not disaggregated by income levels very well, or by gender, or by race, and all these different factors. So to really understand these issues, sometimes it needs to be complemented by the more social analysis. And so we really have to look at both the data, but also what are people saying, and how do we complement some of that with some of our work with that is really important. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Eric?
Yes, thank you. Some general comments. I use indicators a lot, and I have very low trust of them. And I think that's a healthy way to approach it. Indicators indicate. That's what they do. They're good if they point to something where you can do a more appropriate intervention or investigation. They can show where there might be emerging challenges that need to be addressed, Or hopefully the idea with the SESGAP DEA is to say, amongst all this set of indicators, there's only so far any one individual country can go. And you only ask for that from that country. And otherwise, it's a global challenge. That's my hope. But then once you sit down and say, okay, this is what can be done within the country, the information it gives is these other countries have been doing, perhaps performing a bit better on this. And you say, well, no wonder, because they don't have, this kind of industry that we have. And you go, okay, fine. We really have to do an appropriate analysis for the country. At that point, the indicator has done its job, and you're sitting down and you're doing an analysis for a country to try to reach sustainability goals that have been identified through a nationally relevant process. And then why do international institutions focus on the economy? There's so many levels to that. One is because of a widespread belief that everything gets easier when you have higher GDP, that you can pay for any damage that you incur on the way. And another is the simple truth that it's easy to report economic indicators, and for that reason, people watch them, and countries, governments rise and fall based on economic performance. Other aspects, so society and the environment, you have to really point to them, and they're fuzzier, and it's harder to make claims. And so people say, nah, it's not really working. But with the economy, it's easier to point to, and that's part of it. And so there's only so much that a government can do. This is another reason for global, long-term engagement to reach these challenges. Regarding whether an indicator eventually turns out to be misleading, I think the carbon emission one, that one's a little tricky for me, because by this point, countries have done emissions inventories. Those methods have been evaluated for a very long time. But that set aside, I mean, let's not talk about that example, because the point is clear. You can use an indicator that turns out to be misleading. And that's very problematic and not that rare. That's another reason to be very careful about indicators. Even if it's a decent indicator in the case where it was developed, it may not translate. It might not mean the same thing in another context. It might be measured completely differently. Forested land is measured very differently in different countries. So FAO has two different reports. One is based on national reporting, and those are not comparable. And another one is a systematic method that they use for their forest assessment report. And you've got to be careful. Another way it can be misleading is, do you have a causal chain in mind about how this indicator affects other things and how things affect that indicator? Well, check the causal chain and make sure that that's appropriate for that country. Make sure that keep an eye on the research about those causal chains, because those can sometimes be shown to be mistaken or misleading. This particular method, so going on to the next question about accounting for interactions between indicators. So I will say briefly that Emily's approach to using the social driver pressure response framework is a way to unpack interactions between indicators at a very general level. And that's used to kind of say, well, which are the most important? Which ones really have an impact on the others? that SESGAP DEA, or DEA more generally, it implies interactions between indicators because that kind of sets up the frontier, but there is no process necessarily involved. So I hope that makes some sense. Basically, you say the way that countries have acted, there seem to be some relations here that provide constraints. And we're just going to say the constraint, it can be seen in the data. That's all. To really understand what's going on, you have to dig deeper, and then you get to different disciplines. And this actually is one thing that I like about it, is because understanding some of those, you can't do it with one discipline. It forces you to bring different disciplines in to understand it. So this method does not, but you can then go on to a further analysis where you have a discipline-specific or multidisciplinary model, either conceptual or mathematical, that you can use to get some analysis. And then how to deal with the weights. The weights are have to be determined. Well, okay, have to be. There are standard methods for identifying weights based on the kind of distribution of numbers in a data set for DEA. And you do that just to get your desk study finished. That's what I did. That's not really what you want to do. What you really want to do is go and ask the question, if is an increase in this output more important than a decrease in this input? And there are ways to ask people for representative numbers, even if there's not a firm number associated with it. Some elicitation techniques for experts. And here it would be comparing one by one, because that's how the weights are determined, by a one-by-one comparison. And then you can put it together into a system of weights. We have not done that, but that's a possibility. And I agree with Emily, it will be country specific most likely, or community specific, or whatever it might be. Thank you very much. There's 2 more minutes. Antoine, that's all you have.
I will try to conclude this extremely rich discussion. I mean, it's not a surprise to me. Every time you try to combine ecological, social, and economic dynamics in a strong sustainability approach, you have an extremely rich discussion about multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and complexity, and so on. So it's really nice. What I will try to, what I take as a highlight of our discussion is I think the usage of data to try to lay out the situation, the state of affairs, and keeping in mind the limitation. And I think we should never, I cannot agree more than with Eric, we should know that all of the data we're using is also a social construct with a strong statistical bias. And so yes, we are measuring some things, but with a social construct around it. And sometimes it might not be applicable or legitimate to use it or relevant to use it for what we are using it. And fine, as long as we know it, it's okay. I think it also clearly highlights the fact that we need to have this qualitative discussion ongoing, and not always on qualitative helping the quants to do something that they can't really measure, but having some sort of a hierarchical view where qualitative feedback into quants and then quants do their own thing. You have to have this constant discussion where what comes out of your model, what comes out of your quantitative analysis, does it make sense with what experts and what more qualitative approaches, and can we ensure that we keep on having discussion at a peer level and not on a hierarchy level? And I think this is certainly very important. The last point we didn't really mention, but I think it's crucial to mention it, so I'll do it here. We need to talk about uncertainty. We need to make sure that we propagate uncertainty on what we measure and on what you compute. And we need to change the way in which we make policy so that we actually do robust policy decision and not optimizing policy decision. Because given the uncertainty, what you think might be optimized actually might completely not be optimized. And so what the idea is to deliver on what you want to attain. And this is the idea of strong sustainability. Can we deliver on a sustainable world? And ensuring social, ecological, and economic sustainability at the same time. Emily, Eric, thank you very much for this discussion. Everyone, thank you for participating in this discussion, and I certainly look forward to the next webinar that will take place in the coming weeks. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Are we off the air?